Cathedral of Speyer, burial church of 4 emperors and 4 kings, is one of the most important churches built in the Romanesque style. At the time of its construction, it was the largest church in the Occident. The cathedral towers high above the Rhine, on the eastern border of the city of Speyer. It consists of a long-stretched nave between 2 cross structures and twin towers east and west. Today, the cathedral stands isolated in a park-like surrounding. Formerly, as shown here in the model, it stood close to the town wall, encircled by buildings dedicated to the spiritual community life of the Episcopal Palatinate. The monumental cathedral towered above all other buildings, as it still does today. Over the centuries, the cathedral has suffered heavy damages, which have, however, always been repaired. The present appearance of the portal structure dates back to 1850 and was designed by the architect Heinrich Hübsch in the neo-romanesque style of the time. This drawing, dated 1607, shows the portal structure before the destruction of the city and cathedral in 1689. We assume that this is also what the cathedral originally looked like from the west. The construction of the cathedral was started after 1025. The oldest and most completely preserved part of the cathedral is the crypt, its lower part. In Speyer, the crypt extends onto the entire east part of the church. Two square cross vaults cover the crypt and rest on 70 columns and piers. Every cross vault is bordered by broad arches. Also called a cross-groin vault, each one represents a unit of space with a center where the groins intersect. Cubiform capitals hold up the weight of the vault. Cube and sphere intersect and form the transition from the rectangularity of the arches and plates to the circular shaft of the columns. 2 stone plinths and 2 Taurus moldings, separated by a scotia, form the column base. Arcades of semicircular arches and columns are characteristic of the dignified and somber early Romanesque style. Above the crypt, the east part of the upper church in its monumental dimensions was constructed next. Thus, religious services could be celebrated in the sanctuary as construction of other parts of the building continued over decades. This is a tunnel or barrel vault. The weight of the vault rests continuously on mostly solid walls. 2 barrel vaults intersecting at right angles form a cross vault, invented by the Romans. The main load of the cross vault is transferred to the 4 corners. The wall portions in between are non-supporting and can have large windows. By raising the center of the vault, a more advantageous relationship between load and support is obtained. Only the invention of this technical trick permitted the vaulting of such high and wide rooms, like the aisles of Speyer. We know very little about how the vault was constructed. But written and pictorial descriptions provide hints about the masonry and carpentry techniques in these times, enabling us to reconstruct the process as follows. A wooden scaffolding was placed on the capitol. On top of it, a wooden formwork was fabricated, pre-constructing the vault form. The entire construction was propped up by other supports, which were anchored in wall holes. On top of the vault formwork, a layer of porous and lightweight rock was embedded in mortar. A thin application of mortar evened out the surface and protected it from moisture. When the mortar hardened, the scaffolding was removed. The aisles of the nave have an austere spatial effect similar to that of the crypt. A somber calm emanates from the rows of piers and half columns with abstract cubiform capitals. The unadorned austerity of the interior aisle walls corresponds to that of the large surfaced citadel-like exterior walls. This drawing of the reconstruction of the nave gives the impression of harmonious order, solidity, calm, and strength. The high casket-like shaped room was probably closed up by a wooden ceiling or by an open roof structure. Below, in the middle aisle of the crypt, we find the tomb of the cathedral's founder, Conrad II. He was the first German emperor from the line of the Sauer. The archbishops of Cologne and Mainz passed crown and scepter to him. Here, the Empress Gisela, worshiping Christ. Conrad's son, Heinrich III, continued with the construction of the cathedral. On his side, we see the Empress Agnes. The emperor himself did not live long enough to witness the consecration of the cathedral, but his son, the 11-year-old Heinrich IV, did. In later years, the burial place of the Salian emperors was covered as an antechamber to the crypt. 2 iron straps protect the simple stone coffin of Conrad II, who was buried in the center of the construction site. Heinrich III was buried at his father's side. Next to him, his son, Heinrich IV. In 1080, 20 years after its consecration, Heinrich IV ordered large sections of the cathedral torn down and reconstructed according to a newly developed concept. It was executed in what became known in art history as the High Romanesque style. The cathedral is a cruciform basilica. The sanctuary, with its half-domed apse and tunnel vault, forms the headpiece of the cross. The transept and the nave form the other parts. The center is where the nave and the transept cross. It is square and topped by an octagonal tower with a cupola. 4 triangular elements, called pendentives, form the transition. The Baroque roof of the cupola was built in the 18th century. To the left and to the right, we can see the roof of the transept, forming the cross. The transept and the crossing were vaulted during the High Romanesque building phase of the cathedral, under Heinrich IV. The 2 cross ribs were built later, probably after a collapse. Also High Romanesque are the gallery, called Dwarf Gallery, and immediately below, the eaves. The dwarf gallery leads around the entire building. The dwarf gallery brings perspective, light, shadow, and a sculptural enrichment to the exterior. No earlier building shows such a large-scale concept and perfect execution of Romanesque architecture. The forms of the capitals, the column shafts, and the column bases vary. Irregular ornamentations are predominant. It is evident that the stonemason put his tools down in the middle of his work, with no intention of ever taking them up again here in Speyer. Similar work stoppages can be found in the interior. In 1106, during the last phase of the completion of the cathedral's ornamentations, Heinrich IV died. Because his son Heinrich V did not concern himself with the cathedral's construction, one could speculate that the stonemasons were not paid. They probably abandoned their work, moving on to where they were needed and where they would receive wages. The reconstruction under Heinrich IV is characteristic of a greater display of splendor. The southern transept wall is an example of architecture with sculptural and spatial depth, as well as rich ornamentation. Entire chapels were carved out in the interior of the walls. Here, in the interior space, the ornamentation is reduced. Instead, the mass of the wall has been proportionately perfected. Everything is divided, articulated, and blended together. From the transept, we look into an aisle whose spatial effect, as we now know it, reflects the early Romanesque building phase. Comparing the walls of the aisle to those of the nave, one notices that every second pier of the middle aisle has been strengthened by a half column. These piers, being corner supports of the cross vaults, had to be strengthened. Technically, this became necessary as the wooden level ceiling was replaced by the stone cross vault. Simultaneously, the wall of the middle aisle received an alternating rhythmical order and greater sculptural expression. Plate-shaped intermediate capitals reinforced the soaring power of the wall elevation. To span an interior 33 meters high, 14 meters wide, and 71 meters in length with cross vaults was a daring feat that most likely was undertaken for the first time at Speyer. The extraordinary construction of the Cathedral of Speyer becomes even more obvious if a comparison is made to other buildings. For example, to the early Romanesque cloister church of St. Michael in Hildesheim, which was under construction when the Speyer Cathedral was begun, or to the cathedral in Strasbourg, which was begun as a Romanesque building, but was finished in the Gothic style. Only the genuine Gothic cathedrals, like the one in Cologne, could surpass the Speyer Cathedral in grandeur, brought forth by a new technique to build vaults. What was the color effect of the cathedral? The use of red and yellowish stones at the west portal is an intended means of enrichment and can be found in many Romanesque churches. But mostly the stone was not left as it was. The naked stone character that prevails today in the interior surely did not exist at the time of construction. The small stones were plastered. The large stones were painted on the inside as well as on the outside of the cathedral. Red dominated. Red lime wash was probably used to even out the irregularities of the masonry. We can only speculate on the basis of color traces and mortar remains. Today, only on an arcaded arch in the crypt can we recognize a painted lace ornament. We do not know to what extent painted ornaments existed otherwise. We do know, however, that Romanesque churches were often partly decorated with paintings and ornaments. In the middle of the last century, King Ludwig of Bavaria commissioned Johann Schraudolph to decorate the walls of the Speyer Cathedral with Romanesque history paintings. 100 years later, during a thorough restoration, the frescoes were removed, with the exception of this picture cycle on the walls of the upper nave. Last restoration, which took 15 years, the cathedral more or less regained the appearance it had in 1106 under Heinrich IV. It stands today as a massive reminder of a glorious architectural feat in the Romanesque style.